Selamat pagi. I think we can do better than that. Selamat pagi. That's better. Can I invite my two esteemed panelists, Mr. Ratin Roy and Mr. John Hawkswort, to the stage. We've got a very exciting panel discussion, and I would like to request you all to wear your thinking hats, leave your presumptions, because we are peering into the future, not 5-10 years, but all the way to 2050, and try to make sense of what the world will look like. With that, let me start by just making a few scene-setting remarks. At the dawn of the 21st century, it was referred to as going to be an Asian century. 18 years down, undoubtedly, it has lived up to the expectations. And some commentators would even say surpassed that expectations with the performance, economic and others, by the Asian economies. Now, sitting at 2018, Ibu Mantri made some really important points. Asia has benefited from a global economy that has had a more or less predictable rules-based system. It has benefited from the integrations that has undergone, but at the same time, there are also factors, known unknowns, like technology that Professor Robert mentioned, and also the limits that are posed by environment, which I haven't heard yet emerge. These are going to be important known unknowns that are probably going to have implications for economies like Indonesia and the rest of Asia. So with that scene setting, I would like to welcome Mr. John, who's with the PwC PricewaterhouseCoopers in London, to give his presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Can we get the slides sort of on the full screen? Thank you very much. So thanks for the invitation. It's also, like Professor Lawrence, my first time in Bali. I'm very impressed by how beautiful it is. I only wish I could spend more time here for a holiday. Maybe next time I'll come back for a family holiday rather than a business conference. But it is a pleasure to be here and to talk about some research that we published last year under the title, the modest title of The World in 2050, which I understand has received some attention in Indonesia and elsewhere, and is actually one of a series of reports that we started producing in 2006, and every 2 or 3 years we produce reports on this, under this general theme, which is really looking at the shift in global economic power from advanced economies, the G7, to what we call the E7, which is the 7 largest emerging economies. So that's the 4 BRICS that Goldman Sachs sort of popularized in the early 2000s, plus 3 other economies that we thought at the time has great potential: Indonesia, Mexico, and Turkey. So just contrasting the biggest 7 advanced economies with the biggest 7 emerging economies. And I also want to pick up on some more recent research we've done, just published in September, on the impact of automation on jobs, which really picks up again on some of the themes that Professor Lawrence has talked about, but specifically for China, where we've done the research. And also to talk a bit about what both those pieces of research might mean for other emerging economies, such as Indonesia. So that's my agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about our modeling approach. I don't have time to go into all the methodological fine print. The reports I'm referring to you can find on the internet. If you just Google PwC 2050, for example, you'll find our World in 2050 report. But I'll just sort of sketch that in high-level terms. Then to talk about some of the results in terms of the projected GDP growth rates, and also the projected relative size of economies and average income levels that are implied by these. But also I want to talk about the fact that these are not forecasts. These are really conditional projections dependent on relatively good public policies being pursued, both globally and nationally, and what some of those public policies are, and then link that in particularly to this debate on automation and jobs. So how have we modeled longer-term GDP trends in these World in 2050 reports? Well, firstly, we are looking at the longer-term trend over decades. So we're not looking at short-term fluctuations in economies, the ups and downs, the economic cycle, or even the political cycle over shorter periods of time. We are looking at the long-term supply side factors, which to some degree are more predictable. I think it's almost impossible to predict the ups and downs of the economic cycle myself, but I think to some degree the longer term supply side factors have a degree of predictability that makes them worth looking at. We are assuming, firstly, that there's no sort of major global catastrophes of the kind you see in Hollywood movies, asteroids striking the Earth, absolutely disastrous climate change, wiping out half the population through pandemics or something like that. And we're also assuming that there are no political shifts that completely cut economies off from the flow of new technologies and ideas. So we're assuming that there isn't a large-scale, permanent move back to protectionism. If there was, then I think growth would be lower than we're suggesting. I'll talk about that more later. Now, I think our basic model, which follows the approach that a number of other people, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, IMF, and others have followed, is to take a certain economy, in this case the US as representing the global economic, technological and productivity frontier, and then to think about how other economies can catch up with that. And that catch-up is really driven by a number of factors. I mean, there's a factor around working age population growth, which is really demographics, the size of the labor force. There's a factor around investment in physical capital, including infrastructure, plant and machinery, and so forth. And then very importantly, there's a factor around investment in human capital. So for those of you who are sort of trained economists, we're thinking about a production function approach, but where human capital is included as well as physical capital. So you look at not just the amount of labor, but also the quality of labor. And finally, we have this catch-up factor with the US total factor productivity levels, which is more judgmental, but is linked to things like the quality of institutions, the openness of economies, and various other sort of factors that I think would help to promote the spread and diffusion of technologies and ideas. So that's, if you like, the broad theoretical framework, but I think it's also one it's rooted really in the academic literature of the 1990s, but also is backed up by empirical studies that show that these factors are important, including ones that we've done ourselves, updating previous academic research. And I think we're looking in the latest study at 32 economies. You can see those here. On the vertical axis, you can see, well, on the horizontal axis, you can see the average annual growth in GDP in real terms between 2000 and 2015. And then we can see what the average annual growth projected forward from 2016 to 2050. And you can see that there's a certain similarity of economies. You've got the advanced economies at the bottom, which tend to grow around 1 or 2% in terms of the forward projections. And you've got the economies, the emerging economies, which are generally the fastest growing. In fact, the top 15 fastest growing economies that we're projecting over this period to 2050 will all be developing in emerging economies. We think Vietnam and India might have the fastest potential growth rates of around 5% per annum potential growth. But other economies, Indonesia might also be relatively strong at just under 4% per annum. And that's actually, Indonesia is actually, you can see in this chart, is pretty much where you'd expect based on the relationship between historic and projected growth rates. One notable outlier here is China, which grew exceptionally strongly, the strongest of all of these economies in the past, but where we think there will be a number of factors that will slow it down, to do with an aging population, to do with diminishing returns, marginal returns to extra investment, and also some other factors that we think might limit growth in China in the long run, but China would still grow relatively fast compared to the advanced economies. Now, in terms of this growth rates, you could actually order them in terms of from fastest to slowest, and really say that there's a demographic component linked to population growth, and then there's effectively more of a productivity component in terms of GDP per capita. And you can see that there are some, most of the emerging economies, there is both those components are pushing up growth. And in some cases, like say Nigeria, actually about half of the growth is actually demographics, and a relatively smaller proportion productivity. For other economies, including Vietnam, India, and Indonesia, actually most of it is productivity growth, but there is a demographic element to it. These economies are still in their demographic sweet spot, where the working age population is tending to increase as a share of the total population. As earlier Whereas some other economies, most of the advanced economies, not all of them, but most of them, particularly places like Japan, Germany, Italy, are actually getting to the point where actually you're getting into negative demographics in terms of negative working age population growth, pulling down total GDP growth. And some emerging economies, notably Russia and also China, are also getting into that territory where demographics going forward is going to be a factor pulling down growth. But Indonesia is one of those economies where, at least for the next sort of 10, 15 years, it's still in its demographic sweet spot where actually the working age population is increasing as a proportion of the total. And that gives us the window of opportunity to exploit that. But beyond 2030, Indonesia will also move into the position where working age population growth is not as fast as total population growth. There will be more people in older age groups and where demographics may become less of a boost to growth. So there is a window of opportunity there to support growth. Now, we aren't assuming that these growth rates will be consistent over time. We think there will be a slowdown, in some cases quite a marked slowdown in places like China and indeed even India over time. So I think the shorter term growth rates might be higher, and then there will be a tendency in the long run as these economies mature to see a kind of reversion to the mean. And this is in line with quite a lot of academic research, for example, papers by Summers and Pritchett, which look at this reversion to the mean. In the long run, as you grow faster, your economy starts to decelerate. You can't keep growing at these very high growth rates forever. And you can see that in the experience of Japan, South Korea, and other former fast-growing economies in the 50s and 60s, Germany and Italy, for example, in Europe. Inevitably, you have to slow down at some point, and you then revert more to the sort of mean of the advanced economies, which might be more like 1 or 2% growth, depending on your exact demographics. And so the world economy will also tend to slow down. In the case of Indonesia, however, the slowdown, although it might, is relatively less dramatic than in a place like China, partly because it's more favorable demographics. But there is some slowdown over time. Now, what do these relative growth rates mean for the relative size of economies? Well, I think we've tended to focus on GDP at purchasing power parity, PPPs. For those of you who are economists, you'll know that this is a measure that when you're comparing GDP in different currencies, it uses an exchange rate that has been estimated to effectively equalize price levels of a representative basket of goods and services across economies. So it's trying to eliminate the effect of price level differences and get at, if you like, the real quantity of goods and services produced in economies. There are pros and cons to whether you should use that on market exchange rates, but it avoids measures that are very volatile in terms of ups and downs of market exchange rates, and it also provides a better indication of the longer-term picture in some ways, and is more predictable. So on this basis, actually, we've already seen that basically 5 of the top 10 economies are already emerging economies, so-called E7 economies in our terminology. And China's already, actually, about 3 or 4 years ago, overtook the US as the biggest economy. At market exchange rates, that might not happen until 2030, but now I think it's already happened at PPP rates. And Indonesia is already, in 2016, up to 8th place, and indeed the latest IMF estimates for 2018 suggest it might already be in 7th place. So it's moving up the league table quite rapidly. In market exchange rates, it might still be about 16th, so it's got further to move up. But we do think that by 2050, just using the projections and the assumptions that I outlined, China will be very clearly number 1, India potentially in these terms number 2, and Indonesia up to 4th place, ahead of Brazil, ahead of Russia, ahead of Mexico. And it's notable that when we did the original projections in 2006, Indonesia was already projected to move up to 5th place, so we'd already projected these broad trends then. But Indonesia, we think now might perform relatively better than Brazil, and so might be 4th rather than 5th. But generally, we are taking quite an optimistic view of prospects of these emerging economies. 6 of the 7 top economies of the world on this basis would be emerging economies by 2050. And the E7 economies would go from accounting for about 1/3 of GDP in 2016, you can see the chart on the right, up to potentially about half of world GDP by 2050. The G7 would be less than half as big as the E7, whereas now it's only slightly smaller. And the rest of the world would have about the same share of total GDP, so the E7 and G7 in total would be the same. The top 14 economies would in total have the same share of about 2/3 of world GDP, but it would be distributed much more towards the emerging economies. Now within that, I think you could also say that we talk about E7 and G7, but the G7 is quite dominated by the US, the E7 is quite dominated by China and India. You can see here both in PPP terms in 2016, 2050, and in market exchange rate terms, where we've done some illustrative projections, making some illustrative, and I would have to say rather uncertain assumptions about how market exchange rates develop in real terms. But we can get some illustration as to how in broad order of magnitude terms things may shift. And so in PPP terms, the E7 becoming more than twice as big as the G7 by 2050, and China and India alone accounting for a lot of that, but also the other E7 economies, including Indonesia, as potentially the fastest growing of those other economies, also moving up quite strongly as a share of GDP, in total GDP. And market exchange rates, the change is less dramatic, but nevertheless the E7 could be significantly bigger than the G7, even at market exchange rates by 2050. Now, if we break that down to the four major economies or economic blocs, China, India, the US, and the EU, excluding, unfortunately, the UK if Brexit goes ahead. I mean, that's not something I'm happy about, but I think it's something we have to see as the reality at the moment. And I think what we see is in PPP terms, China's already the biggest and will continue to sort of pull away as the largest economy in the world until about 2030, but then will kind of level off as its growth slows down, as its demographics are less favorable. India, by contrast, will start relatively much smaller, but will continue to see a rising share, potentially even bigger than the US and the EU in PPP terms by 2050, with a crossover with the US somewhere around 2040. So there will be this big shift in the league table and of course from the Indonesian point of view, this means that your big markets will shift, and you are very well placed to take advantage of the rise of China and India. I mean, broadly, we see the same sort of trends if we use the market exchange rate figures. Of course, China and India on that basis are lower to start with, so China doesn't overtake the EU until about 2020 and doesn't overtake the US until just before 2030. But broadly speaking, in the long run, because market exchange rates in the long run may tend towards PPP rates as relative productivity pushes up market exchange rates in real terms in the emerging economies. So you get the same sort of pattern in the long run, with India being, for example, similar size to the EU 27 by 2050. So I think there is this fundamental shift towards China and India as the new centers of global economic power. Europe and the US still very important markets, but relatively less so. And so an economy like Indonesia and more generally ASEAN, not only do they have the big ASEAN market, which is very much a free trade area and likely to continue to be so, but you also have these neighboring giants in China and India that you can play off for all kinds of things, not just exports of goods, but also tourism and other factors like that. And therefore, we do see that some of these big ASEAN economies moving up strongly in the rankings. Vietnam from 32nd, actually the smallest of all the economies we looked at now, up to a 20th place by 2050. Philippines from 28th to 19th, and Indonesia, as I said before, from 8th place in 2016 to 4th place in 2050. Whereas other economies, Australia and particularly some of the slower growing, rapidly aging European economies like Italy and Spain, seeing big falls in their relative rankings. Now, I think it's also important, though, to look at not just at total GDP, but also at average GDP per person, GDP per capita. And here we do measure it in PPP terms only, because I think that's more relevant for looking at relative living standards. And what this slide shows for selected economies is the 2016 relativities in US dollar terms, and the projection in 2050 in constant 2016 US dollars. And you can see that in the US, for example, it implies a more or less doubling of average income levels, even that the US has relatively modest growth rates of less than 2% on average. But it's the emerging economies that see the faster proportional increases. And in the case of, say, China, we're talking about going to a situation where by 2050, China could potentially have average income levels in the same ballpark as the UK today. I mean, one should never get hung up on precise figures here because you can't make precise forecasts, but in the same ballpark as UK today. So in that sense, a higher income country. There seems to be a few problems with the slides. And Indonesia potentially being at the same kind of average income level, broadly speaking, as you see in a country like Italy today, so, which again I think would be seen as a higher income country. So effectively we are seeing economies like China and Indonesia having the potential to escape the middle income trap, at least if you measure it relative to where economies are today, and rise up to that kind of level of living standards that we would see in advanced European economies today by the middle of a century. Now, of course, those advanced economies will themselves have grown before that, so there will still be a gap, but in terms of absolute terms, that's the kind of living standards that we're projecting. So it is a potential for quite a big prize, even though we're not projecting unbelievable growth rates. We're projecting growth rates of 3.5% on average for China, about 4% on average for Indonesia, about 5% for Vietnam and India. These are not unprecedented or unrealistic growth rates. They're actually rather lower than they've achieved over the last 20 years in general. So what are the challenges and opportunities this poses for public policy? And I'm going to focus particularly on automation and jobs. But firstly, the more general challenges. Well, I think Professor Lawrence and indeed the Minister for Finance earlier talked about many of these. Firstly, there's the question that our projections are based on assuming broadly free trade. I mean, not perfect by any means, that will never be achievable, but no large-scale reversion to protectionism of the kind we saw, say, in the 1930s. And the thinking behind that is that, if you look at the current situation, well, we're talking about the long term here. Presidents come and go, policies come and go. But the economic logic behind, if you like, a policy that's more orientated towards free trade and therefore the free movement of ideas and technology across borders, which is the key to getting long-term productivity growth, is strong enough that in the long run that will continue to be the direction of travel. If that's wrong, then in alternative scenarios that we look at in the report, global GDP growth could be anything between 0.5% and 1% per annum on average lower, which makes a huge difference to long-term living standards when you accumulate that over 30-odd years. So clearly this is something that one needs to avoid, and I think regionally there is, as Professor Lawrence said, there's been quite a lot of progress within ASEAN and more generally with the various trade agreements between ASEAN and China, and ASEAN and potentially Europe in the future, and maybe with India as well, which is, as I say, is going to become an increasingly important player in the world economy. So I think even if the US doesn't play ball on a sustained basis, which I don't believe, I think ultimately policy will change in the US, if not in the current president, then in some future president. Even if that doesn't happen, there's still a big market, in and around Asia as well as with Europe, which I think remains fairly committed to relatively free trade. Then I think there's infrastructure. Clearly, this remains a big issue for economies like Indonesia, in terms of both basically urban infrastructure. There's going to be a huge further shift of the population from rural to urban areas, projected by the United Nations and others for Indonesia. And that's going to require great investment in water systems, in housing, in urban transport systems, in order to accommodate that movement. So there's energy systems. And there's also going to be need to transport networks, ports, roads, railways to support the movement of goods, from factories to ports and then off to potential markets, as well as serving the domestic market. So there's going to be a need for huge and sustained infrastructure investment, and one can never say that that's not a priority. That's always going to remain a priority. But I think institutions are also at least equally important. Having fair and efficient administration, having a rule of law which people can rely upon, having an efficient regulatory system. And regulation can be a very, very good thing in terms of promoting good quality product standards, but it can also be a bad thing if it gets in the way of for example, job creation or job mobility. So I think you need to get a balance of the not low regulation, but efficient regulation. And then there are issues around sustainability and climate change, because GDP isn't everything. GDP doesn't include the depreciation of the environment, which perhaps it should do in a more comprehensive measure. And those issues are obviously very front and center for an economy like Indonesia that will be heavily affected by sea level changes, which will also be affected if the world responds and moves more to renewable energy, and so there's less demand for coal and gas and oil and some of the other products that Indonesia currently exports, and therefore it emphasizes the need for diversification into other types of products. So there's a whole series of issues around there. And we talk about them more in the report. I don't have time to go into all of those in detail, but I want to just pick up one that actually we didn't talk about so much in that report, and some people criticized us for not talking about it, which is around automation and jobs. And we've done quite a lot of research for the UK and some other advanced economies on this, but I think the first emerging economy that we've really looked at in detail is China, through research that we published in September. We're talking here about AI and related technologies. Sometimes we use AI as a shorthand, but we mean all of these kind of fourth industrial revolution technologies, which are in a sense enabled by AI, from taking dumb machines that can only operate in very, if you like, ordered environments like factories, like robots operating factories, and actually enabling to operate in the wider world, or greatly increasing the potential of other sorts of technology. So when you get robots that can operate in the outside world, you can put them on wheels and they become driverless cars, or driverless trucks, for example. So all of these technologies are interrelated, but AI can be an enabler of making them smarter and more efficient and more productive, and spreading them out from manufacturing to services. Now, I think that there's a complicated methodology behind these things, and again, there are published reports, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of the methodology. But I think broadly, in terms of the impact of jobs, there's a displacement effect, and then there's an income effect which actually creates jobs. And the displacement effect, in a sense, is quite straightforward. We model that in a bottom-up way using large databases that the OECD in particular has put together that look at about 200,000 jobs across 29 countries, and look in detail at the task composition of those jobs and the kind of skills of the workers doing them, a so-called PIAC database. And actually, we use machine learning techniques to interrogate and analyze that database and to assess the probability of automation in different jobs. And that allows us also to do cuts by industry sector, by the education level of workers, by the age of workers, and various other characteristics. So there's a very bottom-up approach to estimating displacement effects, which we and others have used in various studies, using that sort of task-level database of individual jobs. However, that's almost the easy bit. The difficult bit is to create the job creation side, and for that you need a macroeconomic model, and we've developed actually a global computable general equilibrium model, for those of you in economics, which tries to capture these various other effects on the slide. So, for example, AI and related technologies, as you invest in them, that boosts productivity. Now, that could lead to lower prices, and those lower prices will potentially give people more money to spend on other things. Professor Lawrence referred to this, the kind of effect whereby, in the past technological revolutions, the price of food came down, so people had more money to spend on other things. Typically, those other things will be services, and so that creates demand for labor in providing those services, and it will be particularly those services that are harder to automate in healthcare, perhaps in some areas like tourism as well. Also, some of those productivity will go into higher profits. Those will be reinvested, and that will create new goods and services, and that will again create demand for labor to provide those goods and services. And also, the profits will attract new firms into the industry, and that will increase competition. It will also help to reduce prices, and it will also try to reinforce these effects. And it's all of these, what we call income effects, which are the reason over the last 250 years, every time we've had a technological revolution, people have got worried about the effect on jobs, and Professor Lawrence illustrated that going right back to the Luddites. And Luddites are absolutely right to be worried about their own job. If you were a skilled weaver in Nottingham, something like that, then your job was going to be affected by the shift to factories. But the point is that other jobs are created. Now, nevertheless, those people, Luddites were right about their own job, and some of those would have been the losers from that wave of the Industrial Revolution. But ultimately, as these positive effects work their way through the economy, there were enough new jobs created, employment as a whole remained roughly the same or even went up a bit in most of these industrial revolutions, and productivity rose so that real incomes could rise. So you actually got something that in the long run was beneficial for everyone, but in the interim, which could take many decades, there would be lots of losers from it because of the job displacement. The people who were displaced weren't necessarily the people that got the new jobs. So we have to model this macroeconomically. So firstly, I think just on the displacement effect for China, I would distinguish between what the analysis I described earlier gives you is really a probabilistic analysis using machine learning techniques of what the probability of job loss might be in different industry sectors, and just aggregating across the big sectors. So the total, the sum of the two bars is the potential proportion of jobs at high risk of automation. But high risk doesn't mean 100% risk. So applying the probabilities, and often you see newspaper headlines using things like the Frey and Osborne study, they're talking about the potential risk. That doesn't mean that all those jobs will be automated. Just because it's at high risk, it might not be automated. There might be economic reasons why it's not automated if labor costs are still relatively low compared to the cost of robots. It might be legal and regulatory reasons, safety concerns about driverless cars that means they're not automated. There might be organizational reasons to do with inertia in introducing new technologies, or the fact that new technologies don't fit with legacy technologies, as we've seen with trying to apply AI in healthcare in some cases. So there may be all sorts of reasons why the actual displacement is less than the potential. But for China, we estimate that the potential displacement across the economy as a whole might be around a quarter, 26%, compared to potential of about 40%. And that might be a bit higher in manufacturing, a bit lower in services. That's actually a bit higher than we estimate for the UK, where we think the actual displacement over the next 20 years might be around 20%. So on that basis, you might think, well, China's more exposed. But when we do that macroeconomic analysis on the other side of the income effect on jobs, all of those factors leading to job creation, then we find actually that the income creation on jobs is even greater for China, more or less around, I think about 38% is our sort of central estimate. Of course, all of these things are within ranges of uncertainty. These are central estimates, not single point forecasts, so we shouldn't overinterpret the precise numbers. And that would be potentially higher in areas like services, where in things like healthcare, in other services that, as Professor Lawrence said, have high human contact, that are not so easy to totally automate. Tourism as well might be an example. You will actually see more jobs. And that will also include some high-tech jobs, but many of them will not be high-tech jobs. People often think about these technologies only creating high-tech jobs. You have to be a computer programmer or a machine learning expert. No, most of the jobs will not be high-tech jobs. They will be general service sector jobs as a result of generally rising incomes, quite often in either non-tradable services or non-automatable services. There will also be potential, at least in China, jobs in construction as urbanization continues. And the industry is, we did see that there would be jobs, but there would be a shift between different jobs. I'll come on to that more. Agriculture may be rather less so. So I think the net effect we actually saw as positive across China, perhaps surprisingly. For the UK, we found a broadly neutral effect, with job displacement estimated about 20% and job creation about 20%. So it's roughly neutral, and we think that's fairly similar for other G7 economies, although we haven't done the detailed analysis, but based on other analysis we've done, we think that UK is probably somewhere in the middle of a range for G7. For China, we actually see a net creation of jobs. So people are very worried in China about destruction of jobs, and that will be the case. There will be quite a lot of jobs, possibly around 200 million jobs displaced over the next 20 years. So there's plenty of people to be worried, plenty of Luddites who are quite logically worried about loss of their jobs, but potentially significantly more jobs created, perhaps anywhere up to 290 million. So a net gain of 90 million, about 10% or so. Now, of course, there are lots of uncertainties around this, and the report includes various sensitivity and scenario analysis, but in most cases, we think that, except in rather extreme scenarios, the net effect should be positive. And I think if we look in more detail, we've talked about services, jobs that require human touch, construction, the sort of jobs that occur as you urbanize further and you need more infrastructure, and that will also apply to Indonesia, I think, in both those categories. Agriculture, probably a negative net loss of maybe 10% as you automate more of the agricultural processes. Industry, interestingly, in China is about net zero. I mean, there is a small positive, but this is well within the margin of error. It's effectively zero. So you lose a lot of jobs in some of the low-value, previously labor-intensive sectors, and this has already happened in China, of course, over the last 5 years or so, as jobs in textiles and plastics, toy manufacturing, and so on, moved to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, and maybe even Indonesia in some cases. I'm not sure, but you will lose some of those low-value-added, easily automatable jobs. You will gain potentially, though, in China, jobs in making the robots, making the driverless cars, making the other products, the other smart machines that this technology enables. So China will move up the value-added chain, and you can see that that's the government policy. Now, whether Indonesia and other emerging markets can emulate that and get this sort of neutral effect in manufacturing, I think is more difficult. China is ahead of the game here in terms of its government strategy and its investment and where it is now. But that's the potential. So how do you maximize the benefits of AI? Well, I think in China there are well-developed AI plans and you have to implement those, and the same will probably be true of Indonesia. I know that the Prime Minister and other ministers have got plans there. I think you have to capitalize on rapid urban expansion by putting AI and related technologies at the heart of that, try to create smart cities. At the same time, I think you have to foster global open innovation networks so you get maximum technology transfer, and that will include encouraging foreign investment that can help with that technology transfer. At the same time, you need to mitigate some of the negative effects, ensuring as far as possible the benefits are spread equally. It could be a stronger social safety net through things like providing better healthcare, public healthcare. It could be support for rural areas that may be suffering from the decline in agricultural jobs. And it could be, of course, about skills, partly investing in STEM skills, investing in the retraining of older workers, encouraging lifetime learning. I'm not personally, like Professor Lawrence, I share his view that I'm not really a fan of universal basic income. I think it's better to teach someone to fish than just to give them fish. So I think skills-based things or things like working tax credits may be a better method than just universal basic income, which, in order to apply it across 260 million people in Indonesia, would have to be very basic indeed to be affordable. So I don't really think that's the way to go. I think there are other policies that are better targeted. And I think you do have to facilitate global geographic labour mobility as well. So in summary, I think the world economy, I'm a relative optimist in the long term, even though there are clearly challenges in the short term. I think the world economy could more than double in size in real terms by 2050. I think that there will be a big shift towards the E7. Obviously, China and India will be at the forefront of that, but economies like Indonesia, Vietnam, India also growing relatively strongly. I think there are a whole range of policy implications about how to enable that growth in terms of avoiding protectionism, building institutions and infrastructure, developing human capital, and also trying to do what I said about meeting the challenge of automation, not by trying to slow that down, because I think that's the key to one of the keys to productivity growth, but actually to maximize the benefits and mitigate the costs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Could I leave you with a question to ponder on while we listen to the next speaker?